everybody is dealt different cards. It is important to figure out how you want to win and why you would win in a particular, thing. Like, because if your competition is not doing something, that's your spot, that's your opening.
Today's guest is Jakub, also known as Kuba, who was until very recently the CMO of Neptune.ai. Neptune was just acquired by OpenAI for an undisclosed amount. And Jakub is also a prolific writer on developer tools marketing with his publication Developer Markepear, which I consider to be the gold standard resource on DevTools marketing. And if that's not enough, Jakub is also so good at chess that he has his own Wikipedia page. In this episode, I asked Jakub to reflect on the last 7 years of Neptune, as well as all of his writing, to share what actually matters when it comes to building a great dev tool. Enjoy. You've had this kind of moment. You guys sold to OpenAI, kind of bit of a dream situation. And this whole time you've been writing a developer marketing newsletter on everything that you've been learning. You've been doing a podcast and running a community. And so you've been very, very immersed while being CMO of a really successful DevTool startup. Do you think there's been things that like you've really taken away from that?
Yeah, for sure. I was actually thinking about, and I have a list on my phone that, the things I want to share, but as I was, prepping mentally for the show, I listened to the last 2 episodes of Scaling DevTools, at least the last 2 that aired by the time of the recording. They're both on product market fit, right? And that's one of the big learnings for me, so something that you sort of know, but then you internalize it. It's basically that if you market a product to a market that is hot, and that the wave will basically get you so much farther than if you market it in a market that is colder. And it's not necessarily about being a niche or not. I actually love niche markets because then you can actually service people way better if you're focused within the niche market, right? So there could be like, sub pockets of the market that is hot and growing, but generally finding a good market, is going to be a big chunk of the win. So, we've been around for a long time, Neptune, right? Now we're getting immersed. We've joined OpenAI. Actually, we're winding down, right? As a company, our external services, but it was around for a long time, 8 years. I'd say 8 years marketing to MLEs, machine learning engineers, data scientists, AI researchers, those different personas over time. They sort of change definitions in a way, or some emerged as more important, where at the beginning maybe they weren't as important, right? But we've had those different moments where we pivoted or shifted our focus, right? Or really doubled down on, let's say, the research side of things or production side of things, or more recently the foundation model training side of things, right? Like we really doubled down with messaging and the product and everything on the labs training foundation models, right? And you're looking at that market is hot, but there weren't that many of those labs or companies. That way more than people would expect, because you have different verticals with things in AI for science or material, or all sorts of internal use cases, etc. But anyway, you do that, and then you see that a certain market being really well funded with a lot of money going in there, and those problems being clear and expensive, right? And you just pulled in, right? You're just pulled into that market, and I think that's it's just a learning that you could have, if you picked well, sometimes by sheer luck, then you could have done all the marketing and all the messaging, all the positioning, all the channels, all the campaigns, everything could have been so much easier. If you just focus on an easier market, if you will. So that was one thing where I'm completely with you, and I think it's easy to forget that, or easy to like get sucked into, this is my vision for the product, and this should be, great for those groups, or or people like me or whatnot. But then you may be missing some of those opportunities, or moving too slowly into something that is just, there's so much pull that, if you just were in that market, you would just win, because, or at least win for a while, right? Because something is very hot. And so I do believe this is very, 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 very important. Obviously, it's, there are other parts of that equation. Yeah, but this is important. But there's a caveat that I wanted to touch on actually there, because I think, yeah, like market is important, right? So obviously, when you talk to investors, investors will push for a good market. And good market typically is going to be measured by, you know, it being big, so the TAM, and whether maybe not so much at Neptune, but with I often see that with advising clients, or talking to people, or talking to founders who have those problems. Is like, you talk to investors. Investors are pushing for a big market, big TAM, and obviously big vision, right? So, you as a founder, you go, yeah, so let's do that, right? Like, it's, you're looking for a big TAM, which is, obviously just, the numbers are often taken from thin air ish, to create that TAM. And you want to, present it, you want to align with investors, etc., right? So they push for that big TAM, right? And big TAM and big vision. Whereas your actual market, the pocket that you are servicing, the, people you can reach, people who come to your website and want to potentially use your DevTool, they don't want a vision. They want the, positioning the product you have right now, and they want it small. The bigger it is, the worse, most of the time, because then it means it's a big migration, big platform, like it's a big project, right? And obviously, like there are situations where this is good, but early on, it's almost never good. So we have those two parts of the spectrum, right? On one hand, big vision, big TAM. On the other, positioning, niching down, good positioning, tight positioning, and a good product that you have today. Not the vision, but the product you have today, which is obviously way smaller than the vision, and way small, and the market you're servicing is way smaller. So that's tension, and oftentimes I see people falling into that, because falling into that investor, or generally like first principles thinking way of solving it is, which is, so yeah, like what is the solution in 5 years, blah, blah, blah. And, it should, how do you get there? So you want to, so let's look at big DevTools. What do they say? Or they're talking about big markets and blah, 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 right? And then you fall into going, okay, so let's talk about the biggest possible vision of this on our website. And let's push this as our messaging, which to me is a big mistake. Almost up until you are about to IPO, I think it's a really bad idea. Because basically what what from my perspective, right? I would say it could be, wrong, but from what I see is like, you are missing out on people you could actually get, retain, make happy, monetize, etc., right? Because you're talking the big picture. And the big picture, like there are many people who could talk a big picture. There could be, adjacent verticals and big products there. It's like, it's very hand wavy at best, and with devs it's never good. And yeah, so you're missing out, because you're not getting those people now, and then it's hard to grow, and then you don't learn about adjacent use cases for them, you don't build adjacent products for them, etc., etc., and you basically are missing out on this entire vision that could have been true had you gone step by step, right? And step by step, as in solve the problem you actually think you can solve today, maybe extend by persona, maybe extend by use case, maybe extend by additional features, additional products over time, and grow into that vision. And I think it's, yeah, like, but it's a real challenge for founders, right? Because you hear, you talk to investors, and investors are like, yeah, like, okay, so this is too small. How can you talk like this in the header of your website? because this is so small, right? And you're like, yeah, like for you, it is. But like, why should you write the website for the investors? You shouldn't, right? But they have a point. They have a good point, investors, and they should be pushing you for the vision and that big picture and the big TAM and the big market. Because yes, the market wins over the product, over the team, in my opinion. But it's not as simple as, claiming the market and then, then you're good. It's you have to go those small use cases, small things from my perspective, and grow, unless you are going, for the entire platform end to end, etc. But it's a completely different bet, and very rarely do people win doing that.
So the investors are not wrong. They should push. I'm repeating what you said. They should push for the big market, but that doesn't mean that that's what you put to your customers. Just you can create that vision for the big market without pushing that on your customers and trying to like convince them like,
Yeah.
oh, like, yeah, we're transforming the cloud.
You need both things, right? Like you need to have both of those things at the same time, right? So positioning should be tied based on your reality, especially when you go with DevTools. The more enterprise you go, the more in the future you can go, as in, because the big enterprises where when they buy you, you have, it takes time. It takes a few quarters to buy, so you have a few, sort of extra quarters to build, right? The things you claim in that presentation with the big, dollar sign at the end, right? But you have a bit more time, right? But still, it's it's sort of based in, in what you have right now. And again, the more tech, more dev you go, then the more based in reality it should be. The more PLG, the more to the the positioning should be more about today and what you have now. But at the same time, you want to have that vision for the future, right? That you and it's sort of like your outlook on where this should go or where this could go, and what's your, depending on how the market, what are the things that are happening in the market, in the ecosystem, where this could go, right? So you want to have the vision, you want to have that communicated to investors, but it doesn't mean you should be saying that on the website, right? Or, not necessarily in like you could say it on the about us page, but not on the whole page. And oftentimes, I see people, try and basically align all the messaging to what, that having the same, messaging for the investors and for the customers and for the employees, right? Or people you want to join your journey, but it's not good, in my opinion. Those are completely different things, and yeah, and they cost you. Like going too much into the future when you should be talking about what you have right now, and actually messaging what you have right now will cost you. That's what I think. So that's a part there, and there's a really good thing that you could, any founders listening, and it's a funny test that I run so many times, and so often it's just other things. So anyway, the test goes like this. I talk to founders. So founders, I see the header. So, we have the H1, we should have the subhead. There are some words in there, right? And so they should, in theory, explain what the product does or what it is or whatnot, right? And I ask founders, like, what is the product, right? Like I ask them, and they give me an answer, right? And probably like 9 out of 10, 8, 9 out of 10, this answer is completely different from what is in H1 and subhead. And it's not even, and then I ask them, so why don't you use this explanation, your H1 and subhead, like, democratizing whatever you're democratizing, or, like streamlining stuff. Why would you explain it in a way that a real person would explain to a real person here and not there? And yeah, it's like, oftentimes there's like, it's either a push, it's either, I wanted to put something here that resembles those big companies that I admire. And, so you're basically copying, I don't know, Stripe, GitLab, whatever, you copy that, and, or a decent flavor, right? And you put it out there, and you shouldn't, right? Like you should, especially early, if anything, if you're comparing to Stripe, look at Stripe in 2000, what is it, 14 or 15? Go to Wayback Machine and look at that messaging. It's promise you it's different than what it is today, or GitLab for that matter. And pretty much everyone, as they change, they grow, the brand changes, the goals change, etc. Makes complete sense. It just, you are not doing that. Oftentimes as a founder, you're just taking, swayed by investors potentially, or swayed by the heroes that you have, right? In those companies that you love, you just go for that messaging that hurts you, because it doesn't really talk about who you are, what you do, how you are different, and you know, and then it doesn't make it easier for people who go on your website to understand what you do, and does make it easier for them to try it out. Does make it easier to compare to other companies in the space, or whatever, if they're doing an evaluation, right? It just, you put all the burden of comparing, of figuring out the differentiation, of figuring out what it actually is. You put it on the person looking at the website, and that's that doesn't help, right? That doesn't help you, in my opinion.
Yeah. It's frustrating as a user if you go there and you're like, what is it? I don't, oh, is this what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, like to your point, like extending what you said, like there's another little thing that you could do when you do have people who are your users, who are, your prospects, folks, just generally who have a chance to look at your messaging, or, at your demo or whatnot. Ask them, how would they explain it to their dev friends? How they would explain this to other developers, and see what they say. And again, this is often completely different to what you were, to the words you were using. And oftentimes it's actually way better than the words you were using. So you should just copy that to an extent, especially when you see patterns of people explaining certain features in certain ways. It just becomes clear that maybe there is one, benefit or one feature that you have that everyone just focuses on that in the way they explain it to other devs. And then that this should probably be somewhere in the subheader or the header, because if everybody is actually somehow, out of 17 different things that they could have said, they always say this, I mean, that's a signal, that
Yeah.
maybe you should have it there, make it easy for people.
Yeah. Using other people's words. It reminds me of something else that you did. You remember the t-shirts that you made, which I saw
Yeah.
at AI Engineers, and I believe you came up with it by trolling through Reddit, right?
Yeah. I love Reddit, with all the downsides of, of going and spending too much time on Reddit, but I do love it. And yeah, like basically, so what you're trying to do is you try to capture what people are feeling, right? And thinking, and being the insider, right? Like be on the inside, right? Of a particular meme. And yeah, so like you can, if you're a founder who's like deeply embedded in a community, deeply embedded in a particular niche, then oftentimes you actually know a lot of those things. They just come, natural. But for me, as sometimes I'm farther away from a particular niche. I really like to go on those subreddits and really see what people are talking about there. How do they talk about it? What memes do they use? What are the concepts that are, using? And then you can sometimes copy and adjust. You copy a particular idea, and then you adjust it to, to whatever niche you're in, or whatever you're trying to communicate. And yeah, and you basically do that old trick of you don't write, you point, right? There's the copywriting idea, where basically good copywriters, they copy most of the time. Like you don't actually write too much. Like you actually try to copy what your users are saying. This is the best converting copy pretty much always. So you look for what people are saying, what your users are saying, in what words they are saying it, and then you copy that into your copy, And so there's an awesome video of my favorite copywriter, I think, Harry Dry, from marketing examples.
He's great. He's in
You know,
London. So I met him before I
oh,
even read his blog posts. Blogs really.
no way.
He's such a cool
Nice.
guy. Yeah,
He's
so
incredible,
nice.
right? Yeah, and he does great job of marketing copywriting too as a field. But it's such a joy to watch him talk through those things, and he actually has that idea of you point, right? Like you don't write, you point, right? So if you see that particular, you see an idea somewhere, your job as a copywriter is to point to that idea, or copy that idea, right? Not invent your own idea. And often, marketers and founders, fall for, let me actually create an idea here, right? Like,
Mm,
let me put it in words better than anyone, would put it in our subreddit, because it's going to be more complete, and those are the actual words that you should be using here, because this concept, though maybe 5% of people actually knows this concept, but this explains it way better than anyone is
mm,
explaining it here. And then, yeah, like, you may be right, but it's not going to resonate. It's not going to be easy for, people will not connect it to what they already know. It's not going to click for them, etc. Right? So you want to point. And the best marketing is often just copying those stories in some shape or form. You just look what people are saying. What are the pains are they're talking about, and you just copy it. You just look for those paints and you copy them, right? So yeah, so I do like Reddit, do like Hacker News for that. You go through those threads about a particular
mm.
category of products, and you look for you know for ideas there, and things that people are saying, and see if perhaps this is actually something that you're better at, or you actually focus on, and maybe you can talk about this particular thing. And when you do, then use the words that those people are using, and you'd be better off.
Mm. This is brilliant. I really want to make sure that I ask you about the stuff that kind of the same question as at the beginning, but kind of looking at the success of Neptune. Do you think that you mentioned product market fit? Do you think that this was the most important thing? Do you think there were other things that people are not thinking about? What else is important? This is the kind of the final
Yeah.
thing I really want to get to.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. I think one thing that is really crucial, and it would have killed us if we didn't think that way, is, which also connects to those ideas around product market fit, is what's special about you and how do you win? What do I mean by that?
Mm,
So everybody is dealt different cards, different set of things that you have, whether maybe you're a second time founder, maybe you're in the Valley, or maybe you're in Europe, or maybe you're, hyper analytical, maybe you're great writers, maybe you have awesome video people on the team, or, folks who are fantastic at arguing on Twitter, whatever that is, like, you have the set of cards, right? And you have two options basically, right? One option is you try um and you play the same game as your competition, right? So for example, for us, it would have been, we had a fantastic competitor that we competed throughout this entire journey, Ways and Biases. They got acquired by CoreWeave. Huge respect for them. I really like how they played their cards as well. They were in the Valley, well funded. They actually went in the direction of going for the researchers early on. Right, they were partners with OpenAI very early, sort of partnering on building the product, and generally in the Valley, very well embedded in the Valley, and
mm.
playing the meetups game, conferences game, stuff like that,
Sponsored
right?
everything. Mm,
And we're from Poland, like at the beginning, like we're from Europe, from over time, obviously, we really went for, I mean, so basically from the beginning we knew we were playing globally, but we're here, right? Or we're mostly, over time, even as distributed as we were, still the center of gravity is here in Europe, right? And so if we play the same game, if we wanted to play the same game and go for, meetups in the Valley,
yeah.
we, our seed round wouldn't
We,
get us very far. as
Yeah.
compared to them. Like you're losing that game, right?
Yeah.
So we thought, or I thought on my end, on the marketing end, um, I thought, so what are they're not doing, right? For various reasons, whether that be the alternative, cost for them, of not doing those things that they were doing and they were successful for them, etc. So we actually went for SEO. We went for, very heavily for the blog and owning everything from all the tooling landscape in MLOps, and doing things like damming demand with building authority for adjacent categories that we can later, connect to us and get the traffic through
Mm.
that. And then, all sorts of really well researched articles on different how to's, different problems in the space. And, so we went heavy on all of those different things, and we crushed it. We absolutely, crushed that part, right? And it helped us grow, and it helped us get a lot of the success that we got. Um, but had we, the idea of going in that direction was, hey, they're not doing this because they have other things that they could be doing with their time, and
Mm.
they're, doing those other things. So that's our window, right? Because if your competition is not doing something because they should be playing other cards that they have, right? Then that's your room, right? That's your spot, that's your opening. And I think it is important to figure out how you want to win and why you would win in a particular, thing. Like have at least some sort of a bet. And so we did that, for example, and that was really, really valuable. And yeah, we actually did a lot of stuff on the ads front as well. Ads, I think, is generally in DevTools something that is very underloved, if you will. People
Mm.
love to hate on ads, but because of that, they're not really looking at the opportunity there a lot of the times, and they're missing out, I think. Not to say other things are not good. Of course, there's so many ways to reach the devs, and so many better ways, potentially, if you have the right cards, right? Or if you as founders are willing to play them. But otherwise, you got to find the way to win. So, but really thinking through that lens of how do we win, right? What are the things that we want to really do, focus on, and what are the things that we're not doing, right? And what are the games that we don't want to play? Because if we play it, we're basically playing with worse cards, underfunded,
Yeah.
on a, in a place that is just, it's hard to see why you would be winning a particular game. That's not what we want to do, right? And so there are various moments where we actually thought about this, and we played, whether with positioning and actually going more on the production side at a certain point, and then the research side, and then switching later when we understood our cards again, and how the landscape shifted and how the things shifted, and that we, actually have a really good opening, and we should fight for the research, AI researcher persona. But before we actually went in the production direction and heavy on SEO and heavy on those things, right? So I think playing those cards is super important. So that's one thing. Two is, and those are sort of like two, yeah, I definitely missed opportunities and two big learnings for me. So one is that it's pretty much always better to do less but more of it until you saturate. What I
Mm.
mean by that is, like, we did do a lot with the SEO and the blog and things there, but I think we started diversifying too early in some ways, right? I think we could have owned it even more. We could have done more, and it wasn't saturated. But just, the idea of, yeah, like trying those other different things and seeing if we can crush them too. Yeah, it was always there, and, fair point. It could have been that, but I think we would have been more successful had we focused more. And I had a few different situations where we put maybe too much effort on diversifying versus exploiting a particular thing that we saw working. And I think it would have been
Mm.
better to just, once we found those things that were working, really entire team on this thing, until we saturate, or like really feel that we are not adding any marginal value by putting more resources into this. And I think there were, a few situations like that. So I think, yeah, focus in that sense. And and really doubling down until you really see that it doesn't make sense to double down is the way to go.
Would you literally, let's
Yeah.
say like you're doing SEO, you're spending like, let's say 90% of your budget basically just on SEO, like it's just all in on SEO, but then like you don't even have like YouTube channel, don't have video tutorial, like I guess a little bit into like product, but like it just fully focus if it's still working until it stops working, starts slowing down or something. Is that?
Yeah. That's my thinking here. It's
Mm,
like, yeah, like you could add those additional things. For example, YouTube is actually great for SEO, especially now, and
mm,
and those things. And there's like search, there's YouTube search. So we could have really gone for that sort of search and and on that, and we haven't. Um Yeah, but that's basically what I'm saying. And it's in some ways it feels counterintuitive, but because there are like green pastures, etc., etc. But you found something that works. If it works, if it really gets you, good signups, good pipeline, good activated, devs using your product, being happy, you could do
mm,
more. You could do better. We could have doubled down on making every single freaking article 10 times better. And they were great, but they were not everything was great, right? And it could have been something that, you make that comparison, something that everyone wants to share. And we know it's way more work, but we could have done this, and we were ranking number one. So we didn't, we didn't put that here. But then you don't get those additional elements, etc. And I think we should have doubled down, right? So generally, doubling down and focus is, to me, way to go. And something that
yeah,
that I think is like a missed opportunity to an extent, right? Like where we tried a lot of different things, and most of them didn't work, and that's expected, right? But as a
yeah.
startup, I think if you find that moment where you found that, I don't know, the golden trade, if you will, using the I don't know, I was a trader before, so if you find uh, that trade that you can exploit, you should be plowing as much money as you can into this until the market becomes efficient, and that's not an opportunity anymore, right? So I think there is that learning, and then sort of connected to this a little bit, but mostly separate, is taking more risks. That's a marketing learning. Definitely is a better way to go. What I mean by that is, in marketing, the real failure is when it's silence, when nobody hears you, right? When there are crickets. That's the failure. Not when people hate on you on, I don't know, whatever, on Reddit, or or hackers. That's not really that bad. It depends on what it is. Like it could be bad, of course, but but or even if that was, for that matter, maybe, you're doing something that is sort of like a gray area, and maybe, somebody is gonna feel that they're getting attacked, and they shouldn't be getting attacked, and there's like, some sort of heat that you have to take on, on socials, etc. Like that, I think in some spots, when there were good spots, we could have taken more risk, right? And we stayed on a safer side. And I think, I mean, I never know. Maybe that would have been bad. It would have ended up in some sort of like a tragedy. But looking, you know, looking at the market, looking at all those different campaigns over this last, 80 years that I am in marketing, and I really enjoy looking at all sorts of marketing that people are doing. I think, it is heavily skewed game, and you should look for those things that really push the needle, and that, and go viral. Like
Mm,
I hate saying go viral, but like it is something where, like you take risks, and if this pushes a chance of this becoming a top 1% result for you, then go for it, versus pushing the average result. So like you do something that is like good, but you could have done something that is either shit or great. So it's always better to go for shit or great, in my opinion. Like, especially when you have your taste.
but the average will be better.
the average will actually be worse. That's what I'm saying. The average will be worse because you will on it, the results are skewed in marketing, and the average is not seen.
Oh yeah, I guess I meant so like the mean would be better performance, right? Like it was like you
Yeah.
just disproportionate return on like one
Yeah.
campaign.
In that
But
sense,
everything else,
in that sense,
the
yeah.
average one would be bad, but then like it would be made up for by the
Yeah. And then those yeah, like those big results, they get you discovered, they get you seen, and I think like, yeah, like I remember on the last one of the last conferences we went to, we had this idea of putting like, stickers on pavements, right? Or in places where, there were like pedestrian crossings and stuff like that. And we knew that it's like, so we could do it, but it's taking a risk of like, fines, right? And, fines from the city. And we're like, yeah, like it's, we could do it, you could not do it. Or like you could do it out in a, in the, at the venue as well, right? Like like we're way beyond that stage, but like people actually, put some sort of like, stickers in bathrooms where they shouldn't have,
yeah.
they had no business in doing that, but like they did that. And it's like, and, so with those stickers, we actually did think about it, and then, we didn't do it. And another startup did that. And, lots of people saw those stickers, right? And I presume that they, probably, I would expect, I don't know, I have to ask them, but I presume that maybe they got actually, fined. They got a fine of, but it's, you should think about it. So what's that fine, right? And, that fine was probably like maybe a few $1,000, right? Maybe, for what they did. And, but if I could buy, if the venue offered me sticker locations, sort of like on pedestrian crossing for, I don't know, $10,000 or something as a, like, and I could sponsor, I would probably take it, you know, and so I think,
Yeah.
you could think about it this way. And then actually I realized that during, funny enough, during the Comic-Con, because that was the same venue as one of the, conferences that we're preparing for. So during Comic-Con, different hotels and stuff, they put huge banners on there. I mean, huge sort of, billboards on the hotels, right? Like the huge stickers of different movies, or like, Netflix movies or whatnot, right? And and it turns out that it's illegal. Like it's completely, like it's clear violation of city rules. And it's been going on for years, that they basically are paying, the hotels are paying, and, they put the cost on you as well. Right. But they're paying like, I think it's like 10,000, up to $10,000 a day for this. You have to pay to the city as a fine. Right. But, like you treat it like it's 7 days. So it's it's 70K or 100K on top of the, like the, you add it to the price, and then it may
Yeah.
actually be a really good thing to do anyway. And then they are actually an important part of that sort of landscape of Comic Cons, or, or whatnot, or, and, so I wish, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is like, I wish I took a bit more risk in certain spots, and whether that be, something like this, maybe that's actually too much for people, and I understand that. Maybe it's actually too much for me as well, like I don't know, but like, sometimes with, even with the, the blog post you write, the ad you write, like going slightly more, maybe slightly more aggressive, or maybe slightly more, I don't know, snarky or something like that, where maybe, this is, or a bit more personal, a bit more authentic. Maybe, I decided to go a bit more safe. I think that, for marketing itself, most of the time it's better to risk it, or to go a bit more risky, because you have a chance of a bigger payout. And our attention is, and then, generally what you see online is heavily skewed toward those results that hit. And, you, yeah, like you can get, okay results with, doing normal stuff, but yeah, but having those things that hit is just a different, you know, story.
Yeah. So your guide, if I'm surmising on what matters, product market fit, strategically playing to your strengths, playing the cards that you got dealt well, and having like a plan to win there. And then you've talked a lot about like kind of simplicity, talking, using people's words and like having that balance between like the big vision and what you're actually saying, like solving like immediate problems. And then taking bigger risks in marketing. Oh, and before that, doubling down on the strategies that are working. And your speculative one is to be more ballsy, kind of just take the big risk, be naughty potentially. Are you happy with that as a
Yeah, I guess maybe two more things that are that I think are valuable, maybe three. So one, touching on what you said, right? Like with the messaging and stuff, is like and that using other people's words, is that like it's all true. I'm all for it. I think nailing that differentiation is something that people underdo. So there's a particular thing that you are better at, you have an opinion on, and you are not taking that risk of maybe alienating people who focus on a different use case, and you don't put it as a front use case for you, right? So that's also taking a risk, right? You're just doubling down on something that you really see and you really believe, but it is, sort of maybe making those other conversions less likely. So I think people are not doing enough of that, and it would have been easier, to convert folks if had you done it, had you pushed for differentiation a bit more. So that's one. Two, something that I really flipped my mind on during this time is events. I used to hate events, as in I thought it was like a complete waste of money. And now I think, especially now, with more people yearning that live interaction, I think if you do good events, they could be fantastic. And I'm really very bullish on, different side events and those, invite only events that you do during conferences. We had great success with that. And I think there's a lot of value that you can do, that you can deliver through that to people by connecting the right people, and then, and just doing fun things while doing that, and, putting your brand out there. So events is something I really started to like over time. And at the beginning, I was very, I thought it was going to be just a complete waste of money. But we also changed how we did them a lot, so.
And how does that tie in with like, say, you said like the playing to your strengths, like you guys in Europe, like the center of the universe of AI is like SF, your competitors in SF, like how does it, because seemingly that's like different. If you've been doing events, that would be playing into like not your strength, or you still think
Yeah.
it's
No,
better?
so it's a very good point. Very good point. So there's a balance there. Like, like to your point, you play to your strengths, and that's what we did, right? But there are events where everyone is going to go to, and there are not that many of them, right? And you can actually do great things there, right? So instead of just going for a booth, maybe you can even take that money that you would have spent on a booth and do just something different there, right? You do just events during one of those big things, or things of that nature, right? Or yeah. So you can take that idea and still apply it, right? Just with a tweak, with various tweaks. And so we've been to, to lots of those different, different conferences, and did great stuff there. Yeah, but it's a good point where, it's I talked more about at the beginning and those first bets we made, right? Like where initial ideas was, hey, maybe let's go to those conferences early. And early we actually went full digital, let's actually focus on SEO. Let's focus on that engine. And then, that changed over time. But yeah, it was, and, at the beginning, it was hard for me to see how there could be better ROI of doing that versus getting more great folks to write great content, and And so we did that. But I think there's a lot of value there. And I was a bit too bearish on it, too negative on events. And I think you can do great events. That's what I'm saying. And also like I think the landscape, with all the AIs and and everything changed a bit with, people wanting more live things, right? Remember there was COVID on the way as well, so it was during this
Yeah.
time there was COVID, and so that changed a lot of the things as well. So that's one. And there was one last thing I wanted to say. And one thing that I think is very valuable, that I wish people did more. And actually, when I work with founders, it's something that I push for a lot, is front loading the information. So using something like BLAF formats or reversed pyramids. I know it's sort of all over the place with the way I explain things today, but
You're great,
I
man.
I think had people front loaded what they really care about versus build up and then say it at the end, it would have been so much better, right? So there are those ideas where the reverse pyramid is basically that concept where you start with the most important thing and you say it, and then so imagine you were on the battlefield and the lines of communication got shot, and you only you only had one message to send, right? So first you send the most important message, we're under attack or
Yeah.
something, right? You
Yeah.
don't send,
Yeah.
hey, how's your wife doing, or something, like, I don't know, right?
Lovely
Um,
weather.
but
Yeah.
so you want to front load it, and you want to make it easy for people. And sometimes when I see that, and I remember reviewing a lot of that content that we created, and and now working with founders, I see that all the time, is as you build up with something that is not what you want to say. So you always push for what do you actually want to convey, and then you front load that.
So it's like the opposite of every recipe website in the world, where you get like an entire, I guess it's for SEO, you get an entire essay on like their life story, and then at
Yeah.
the end it's got like
Yeah, the history of a
the thing
potato,
that you
and
need.
then
Yeah.
yeah. No,
the,
no, that's
so
true. That's true.
it
Yeah,
should
yeah.
be, the recipe should be the first thing. You need this, like, it's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And then you can actually do that in a way where you start, you know, you start with a high level for those things first, right? So you front load that core information, and then you can expand each point, right? Like, so you expand each point, and maybe there's like a few things that you can say you want to front load again within a particular paragraph, or or a section of an article, and then you go for it. It's way better, way easier to do that in written format than when you speak. But actually, great speakers do that a lot, where they front load those points, and then you go for expanding, right? Versus going for that long, 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 sort of tree of depth on the first point before coming back. I think it's like an Oxford something. There's like an Oxford that no, there are competitions in going like really deep in those trees. I think it's like, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, like that you can actually do that with putting the most important things up there, and then expanding, putting the most important things up there, and then expanding when somebody gets there, and you don't run the risk of people just skipping the most important part, right? Because they
yeah.
had energy to read the intro to the article, and they read the intro, there's nothing valuable, so they skip.
Mm.
Had you front loaded the summary really, or like you front loaded the information that you put somewhere in there, had you front loaded it to the intro, they would have read it, or they would have read more. Or if they had they just read the intro, still you would have delivered the information you wanted, right? Versus you didn't deliver anything because you started talking about how enterprises today are struggling with whatever it is, and you don't say, you don't speak like that to people anyway, right? Like, you do front load. So what's the headline? This is the headline. You do front load it, right? Like, you would never survive. Oh, by the way, that's a really good test as well for people. And I just had a discussion today with the founder, and I shared that with them too. Framework is basically something like, you have that article that you wrote, and imagine you are presenting it to your audience, to the people you're actually trying to reach. You're in a room with them, it's like maybe like a small meetup, right? You're in a room with them, small meetup, you're talking to those people, so it's very personal, right? And imagine reading this article to them. Imagine yourself reading word for word what you have there to those people. And, very often it's like there's zero chance I would read it, to people. This is not like I would just like I'll be, yeah, like there's no way I could read this. This is horrible. Like nobody speaks like that. I would look like an idiot. People would just like boo me out of that room.
Mm.
And yeah, but then for some reason you write like that, and I know you have so much value in you and so many, valuable things that you can say. And actually the article is good if you organize it differently, like you and dropped a lot of those things that are there for no good reason, and you just thought about front loading that information and adding something new to people and generally saving people time, saving the reader's time. It could have been great. So yeah, I mean, it comes from a book that I recommend to people, Writing Without Bullshit, which I find very, very, very valuable and powerful,
Mm.
so
This is awesome. I think I'm going to try and talk to people like this for the next few days. I'm going to front load my speech,
yeah,
see how
try
it
and
goes.
front load. I think I heard is there was an episode. I think it was actually no, I'm not sure on which podcast it was, but like it was with the CEO of that robotic process RPA, robotic process automation, European company. I just forgot about it. It's like a huge one.
Any
Uh,
automation? Any is it something? Automate anything? I don't know. Okay. There's
yeah,
one
and
that's something like that.
yeah, but there's that. Yeah, I can't believe I blanked out on it. But anyway, like the guys, I think he's Bulgarian or Romanian, and and as many folks in this part of Europe, like you go as if you come from like mathematical studies or things around around science, you like to go deep and complete before you go to the next point, etc. So like he would have those like very long meandering sections in his speech. And then he started working as as the company started going IPO and global or whatever. He had some speech coaches, or presentation coaches. And one thing that he learned from them was front loading, and it just like
Mm.
changed everything. So he would have, let's say there's like five things five different themes he wants to touch. So first he goes 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna, so those are the ideas I'll be talking about. And not only that, but there's like a hint of the value in each, and then you go deeper, and then you front load that information again, etc., and it just makes it easier for people to follow and get value from.
Yeah. You don't want to surprise them. It's more like you want to explain it, like tell them what's coming.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because then
Yeah.
then then you make it more likely for them to actually follow that, and remember what it's going to be about, and follow that thought process that you have. Yeah, but I think it's just like a very valuable thing,
Mm.
especially for writing. For speaking, that's great. I wish I learned that. But for writing, I do use that a lot. I do try to, save people's time whenever I write, front load the valuable things up, almost like a TLDR in each section. You can think of it almost like that. Like
Mm.
if you read this section, what people have to understand from this section and from the entire article? What do they have to understand from the entire article? That's that. So let's front load it, without all the bells and whistles, and then go for bells and whistles below.
Yeah. Front load it, baby.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Did so great to have you on. I think you were like you were in the first 10 episodes, I think. Definitely first 20.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think we've known each other for like 4 years now, which is
yeah.
mental. So almost, I think it's almost 4 years because like,
Y-
yeah,
I think
which
so. I
is
think so. Yeah, yeah. I'm quite
mad.
sure so actually, because my daughter, she's 4 or 4 and a bit. Like she says she's 4.5, but she's 4 and 3 months or something like that. She's the day after she turned 4, she was 4.5. But anyway, and I remember starting the entire Markepear project when she was born, right? And I think right around that time you started the pod, and I loved it, and yeah, I'm so happy that we've been, sharing those things with people, and
Yeah.
we're still friends. I like that a lot, and thank you so much for having me here.
No, thank you. And yeah, this is a recommendation that I have, that everyone should subscribe to Markepear. Go to markepear.com. So markepear.com. Go there and you will get the best DevTools, in my opinion, the best DevTools newsletter focused on go-to-market, bar none. And it's weekly. It's brilliant. And yeah, you should subscribe if you're not already. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Kuba, thank you so much for joining. This was honestly like one of my most enjoyable episodes, because I think you gave like a very, very clear thing of like what actually matters. And I always think that that's always the hardest bit, is to like, there's always a gazillion ideas, but which actually matter. And you've just succeeded, and then you've told us like what actually mattered. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, and I hope this was useful to everybody. Yeah, if you have any questions about this or other stuff, DevTool marketing, as Jack said, go to markepear.com or find me on LinkedIn, and yeah, let's chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Kuba. Thanks everyone for listening.